Film Club.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of Film Club. I'm one of your hosts, Andy Harrison, and with me, as always, it's Andy Donaldson.
Hello.
Every week in Film Club, we invite you along to watch a film with us, and this week, we're taking a look at Batman Begins.
The origin story of Nolan's trilogy. Bruce Wayne has a pretty hard life, easy life because he's born into a rich family, but at the same time he loses his parents at a young age. He goes and tries to find himself, tries to find Ra's al Ghul. Nearly joins the League of Shadows and then realises that it's everything that he's trying to fight against. So he goes back to Gotham and he becomes the saviour of the city. And this is, as I mentioned, Nolan's trilogy, the start of his trilogy. Just one of arguably the best superhero films of all time. It's definitely, it was in our top trilogies of all time video that we did. It's some of Nolan's best work. It's some of Hans Zimmer, who did the music, his best work. It is the start of something special. And I think this one is heavily underrated because a lot of people go to the latter two and they're like, oh yeah, they're class and everything, the performances. But if you look at what this is, you know, the foundations that this builds and lead that forward, it's just, it's exceptional.
What the hell are you? I'm Batman.
This is 2005, so it's only about 8 years removed from the previous Batman film, which was Batman and Robin.
Does not feel right, but okay.
No, from Joel Schumacher. And the thing that people have to remember is that this came out in an era where reboots of franchises were nowhere near as common as they are today. You know,
yeah, that doesn't feel right as well. Yeah.
When Batman Begins is released, we were not expecting to get a Mark Webb Spider-Man series followed by a John Watts Spider-Man series. We weren't talking about like bringing back Fantastic Four for the 12th time. We weren't used to things being rebooted. That Batman series had run from 1989 with Tim Burton, and it had run for 4 films spread out. It got to the point where people were sort of done with it. It'd become overly campy. It's very self-aware, becomes a bit of a toy branding thing. It's obviously catering to children, all that sort of stuff. So you put the franchise on ice. You don't do anything with it. You just put it to rest. That might as well have been where, you know, the Batman cinematic lifespan ended. It could very well have ended there. For any other IP, that's where the story ends. You've had your time in the sun. You've had your cinematic adaptation. And Christopher Nolan comes along to Warner Brothers and pitches them this thoroughly grounded take on the character. You know, it got outlandish with Arnold Schwarzenegger firing sort of ice beams and joking about dinosaurs, and you've got
Nice to see you.
Uma Thurman, who's like, you know, be able to control people through kissing them, and it got very, very comic booky and very neon and very, very theatrical.
Yeah.
And Nolan's approach is like, well, hang on, like, what if some of this stuff had to exist in the real world? What if we had to ground some of this? What if Gotham isn't a set? What if Gotham is basically Chicago? Nolan's whole approach to this is like, well, let's ground some of this. It takes a lot from things like Batman Year One, which is a seminal comic that deals with the very first year of Batman existing, and you can see that sort of DNA throughout the film. But for Nolan, I find this really interesting because do you know what Nolan made before Batman Begins?
Go on.
He made Insomnia. Now,
oh, yeah, we watched that. It was good.
That means
that makes
for me. I think when we talked about Insomnia, we talked about the fact that it's part of like what I consider Nolan's early work. And Batman Begins, I think, is actually his first step towards what we consider Nolan today. It's not
Nolan Prime.
It's Nolan Prime. It's not quite there. It's not fully formed. He doesn't quite have that that technical obsessive mastery that he has today. But he's starting that journey. I think that over Batman Begins, and then after this, he does The Prestige. I think over those 2 films, he sort of develops his style and he matures a lot as a filmmaker.
I agree, and we've also got to appreciate as well with the way that this film came out in 2005. Is that it came just before the MCU was established, before it became a thing. Iron Man came out in 2008. And I would like to think that this paved the way to actually superhero genre that we know nowadays is, you know, getting to be quite overrun with superhero films, which is not a bad thing because we went through the wonderful MCU experience. We went through obviously the Batman trilogy and a few others.
You got to remember, at this point, we still didn't refer to the superhero as a genre. These were
it was always just action.
Yeah, they were action films.
Fantasy.
They were action fantasy films, and it wasn't really until the MCU rolled around that we started referring to it as more of its own genre.
And so this is just talking about Nolan, just talking about the genre. We need to appreciate that, the grounded aspect of it. The one thing that Batman Begins does that I'm not too keen on, is it has a couple of weird moments with the bats, and he has backup come in and he sees bats come through. It just looks a bit odd. So that's kind of the old Batman seeping through it a little bit. That fortunately at the end, at the end of this film, just kind of like get worn away, sort of thing. It kind of sacks that off. But what he manages to do is introduce these kind of effects that work really well, besides the bats. These characters that work really well, these relationships that work incredibly well, these villains that work incredibly well, these kind of performances from a stellar cast. I mean, if we look through like some of the fucking names in this film, obviously Christian Bale, who, by the way, can we just appreciate that he came on this from The Machinist that he did a year before, and he put on like 100 pounds of flesh. Michael Caine, who like we did obviously last week, but a completely different role. He's more of a caretaker, more of a looking after role. We've got Liam Neeson, who's Ra's al Ghul, we find out later on in the film. Katie Holmes, who obviously plays Rachel, and she does get recast, to be fair, but I thought she was fantastic in this. You've got Gary Oldman as James Gordon, possibly the best iteration of James Gordon, Commissioner Gordon. Cillian Murphy as Scarecrow. Cillian Murphy's great, and I've also seen him in like kind of protagonist roles, but to see him as an antagonist works so well. He's creepy when he wants to be. But yeah, you obviously Morgan Freeman as Fox as well, and you got Joffrey, before he was Joffrey as well. Got Bale and Kane that have this lovely kind of father-son relationship. It's really believable. You got the friendship at the start with Liam Neeson and Bale, with Ra's al Ghul and Bruce Wayne at that point, who works really well. There's a duty of care, and that kind of comes to hit them in the end, or at least it's Batman at the end. And you got this kind of this ultimate experience of writing, of acting, and this performance, this gritty nature of Gotham. And even to the point of like Batman's upgrade throughout the film, he deals with Fox, and you got this kind of twinkle in Morgan Freeman's eyes, like, I see what you're getting up to here. He's jumping. He jumps off the roof at one point when he sees Commissioner Gordon, and he lands on those steps, and he nearly breaks his bloody back. But then he says, "You got anything that I can fly with?" The way that this film kind of puts everything together, like, it's incredible.
Why bats? Lost away.
Bats frighten me. Each time my enemies shared my dread.
Wally Pfister, the cinematographer, actually at the time, Nolan's long-time collaborator, shot pretty much all of his films. Wally Pfister is the cinematographer for the entire trilogy, and he does
stunning,
an incredible job. This isn't a step above your average superhero film, especially the stuff being made today. It's leaps and bounds beyond your average superhero film. Wally Pfister's work in this is gorgeous, and what I love more than anything is that if I close my eyes and imagine Batman Begins, I immediately think of browns and oranges, because that's what all this film is drenched in. And my favorite thing about that is that that's not the style that he sets for the entire series. He changes it up. If I close my eyes and imagine The Dark Knight, I get blues and steels. And then if you go
that's
to,
what I actually imagine, yeah.
If you go to Dark Knight Rises, you get something much cleaner, more white. And I love the warmth of Batman Begins. I love the fact that it feels like it's a hot pressure. It's like everything's about to bubble over. That's what Gotham is at this point. Gotham, in a couple of flashbacks when you see Bruce Wayne with his parents, you see Gotham in that clean Chicago style that we do eventually see in like Dark Knight and Dark Knight Rises and stuff. But we spend most of Batman Begins in the Narrows, where it's steamy, it's hot, it's dirty, it's grimy, it's grim, it's lit by like tungsten sort of street lights. I love how much of a thick atmosphere he gives this film.
Really is. I'm glad you mentioned that, because it's the way he goes through the streets, and this is what's really good about Batman, and it obviously builds on it as well, is the way that he just traverses through Gotham, and you actually see Gotham as a city. It's almost like you're playing Spider-Man the game, and you're going through the streets, swinging through the cities and everything. Batman before, you only got like a little bit of that. With this, you feel like you do know a lot of Gotham. You feel like you go through and, here it is. Everything, he even mentions in the film, to be fair, everything centers around Wayne Enterprise, and like the monorail that's coming towards them in the end, how that plays a part. There's such a location to this film.
I never said thank you.
And you'll never have to.
Typically, I have a horrible problem with Christopher Nolan and his dialogue. Right, I don't find Christopher Nolan's dialogue to be subtle at all. And here, I think he's got a little bit of a balance because he's got David S. Goyer working on the script as well. But at those moments where that horrible, obvious Christopher Nolan dialogue comes through, I have to admit I do kind of give it a pass in this film, and I think that's because it's a comic book film. Like it's about a guy running around in a big bat costume. Like there's nothing subtle about that. So the idea that he's wearing that thematic value on its sleeve kind of helps it. Not to mention the fact that this script works at such a quick pace. It just keeps going and going and going. The first 20 minutes of this film burn through so much material. It's incredible.
And that's what I like about the evolution of the way it's wrote, about the evolution of the character. You know, he's a kid, and he goes to see Ra's al Ghul, then he comes back and he sees Fox, and he improves his suit over time. Then he fights one villain, they go down, then that villain comes back and he fights another villain. And it's just all this stuff that he has to see. You know, you mentioned before how the city's on edge. Batman, you know, Bruce Wayne himself is on edge, and it comes to fruition in this amazing kind of end scene that it's just a great film, heavily underrated, I believe, out there, especially like the trilogy. But as a film in itself, and it's one that, as mentioned, I always go back to because I love a good origin story. I love kind of a good, as mentioned, like underdog out the trio story. And I think Batman Begins delivers so fucking well.
Definitely. And Scarecrow was done dirty. But there is Batman Begins. You can let us know in the comments below what you thought of Batman Begins. But Andy and I will be back once again next week, where, of course, we're taking a look at The Dark Knight.
Cheers, guys. Take care.
You're watching.